There's an old saying, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Last December, when an officer from the Kitsap Sheriff's Department joined us for lunch, he was teaching us about how to avoid scams and frauds, and he gave us this very advice. If something seems too good to be true, be a little suspicious. It probably is. So if you get a strange email from someone claiming to be a prince from overseas who would like to share their inheritance with you for a small fee, maybe just delete that. Certainly don't give them your bank account information. That is probably too good to be true. Almost everyone has heard of that scam, so we just chuckle and move on with our day. But what if the promise isn't coming from an anonymous email, but from God, and it's the one thing you want most in the world, and the thing you thought for sure you would never have? Today's first reading comes from the 17th chapter of Genesis. In this chapter, God describes the covenant that will be made between God and Abram. In this chapter, God renames Abram, Abraham, and Sarai becomes Sarah. There are 27 verses in this chapter of Genesis. Our lectionary skipped around and only gave us 9 of them. Now, on the one hand, I think we can be grateful for the lectionary writers because they spared us from the 11 verses about circumcision, and we didn't have to hear that in our worship today. But there are a few things they skipped that I wished had been included. For example, there are characters like Ishmael who got cut out of this passage, Ishmael being Abraham's first son with Hagar's slave maid. And I'm always a little concerned when we leave voices out of the text. But more than anything, I wish they had gone just one verse further and included verse 17 in our passage today. That would have made our passage sound like this. Verse 15, God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you will not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. Verse 16, I will bless her, and she will give rise to nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. And finally, verse 17, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, can a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Can Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Abraham laughed. Not just laughed, but fell on his face and laughed when God promised him a son with his wife. And he's not alone. In the very next chapter, Genesis 18, verse 12 says, Sarah laughed to herself, saying, after I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I finally be fruitful? And God heard this and said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh and say, shall I indeed bear a son now that I'm old? Is there anything too wonderful for God? What a different mindset that is. Instead of, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Is anything too wonderful for God? Abraham and Sarah can't believe what God is telling them because it sounds too wonderful to be real, and maybe because they want it so much and think it is no longer possible. So it would hurt too much to be disappointed one more time. They think, this is too good to be true. And in our gospel reading, we have the opposite dilemma. Peter can't believe what Jesus is telling him because it sounds too terrible to contemplate. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus began to teach his disciples and followers that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the powers and then killed, and after 3 days rise again. Mark says that Jesus says all these things quite openly, and we're meant to understand that the 12 disciples are following him along with a big crowd of other people. And he's talking very openly about this. And Peter did not like it. So he took Jesus aside and tried to privately reprimand him, which I gotta say, yeah, is gutsy. Can you imagine? In response to this reprimanding from Peter, that Peter attempted to do in private, Jesus turns and looks back at the rest of the disciples and famously rebukes Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things but human things." Then Jesus called out to the crowd around them and said to them and his 12 disciples, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me." In our context, in 2024, this verse lives in our mind in a particular way. We hear it and think anyone who wants to follow Jesus must pick up their calling, must maybe make a particular sacrifice. We think of it as a reference to the individual vocation that all of us have, the ways that we serve God in our daily lives. But to Jesus' disciples and the crowd listening, it would not have had that connotation. We have had 2,000 years to attach that connotation to that verse. But in the original time, the phrase "to take up one's cross" indicated a really humiliating punishment. When a person was crucified, which the Roman emperor saved for rebels and terrible criminals, people who pushed back against the Roman Empire, they would make the criminal carry their crossbar, which was heavy, like this part of the crossbar. They'd carry it all through town in this really public way, and it'd be exhausting, humiliating. People would jeer at them, and eventually they would drag it to the place where they would be executed. So when Jesus is telling his followers and all of these people crowded around that they should take up their cross and follow him, that is a really interesting thing for him to be asking them. I imagine it sounds something like, "If you want to follow me, you must be prepared to be embarrassed or in danger, to risk your life." It wouldn't have had a softer connotation to them. It would have meant political execution. So no wonder people weren't jumping up and eager to do it. Even for us in our softer interpretation of this verse, it still has a weight to it. Pick up your cross and follow me. And we're not picturing dragging a crossbar to an execution, and it still has weight. For Peter, imagining Jesus suffering and dying was too painful to picture. And for Abraham and Sarah, imagining that they could have a son together in their old age was too ridiculous to be real, too wonderful to be true. I believe God calls us to be brave because it takes bravery to face the things that we want so much but believe we might never have, like Abraham and Sarah imagining a child of their own. And it could take equal measures of courage to face the things we fear so much that we'd rather not talk about them at all. Just like Peter couldn't handle Jesus foretelling his death on the cross, a death that was saved for the most terrible criminals or failed rebellions. But I think God has called us to face those things too. Yesterday, I had the great pleasure of gathering here with all but 2 of our Bishops' Committee members, your elected leaders, along with a wonderful College of Congregational Development facilitator for our annual Bishops' Committee retreat. We were just in the gathering room yesterday. During our time together, we engaged in some fun data gathering in order to start creating some goals for the next year. The goal will be to describe those goals in a mutual ministry agreement, which we would then review this time next year and see how far we got. As a leadership team, yesterday we discussed all the things that we love about this church, as well as our concerns and our dearest wishes for the future. And what I noticed was that we, and I include myself in this, and I think it's an Episcopalian thing, we like practical, safe, achievable goals that are measurable and things we know for sure we can do. And that is not a thing wrong with that, just so you know. Setting achievable goals is an empowering habit. In fact, if you set a goal and you achieve it, it encourages you to know you could achieve the next one. So even in something like weight loss, we always told people at the Y, don't focus on the number, because you can't control that. Focus on your habits. So if your goal is, I'm going to work out once this week, you can do that. That's within your control. So setting realistic goals, no problem there. That's a good strategy for individuals and organizations. And I still wonder, like Peter, are we Christians sometimes a little too afraid to talk about the things that scare us because we don't want to jinx ourselves? And on the flip side, I wonder, like Abraham and Sarah, are we Christians a little afraid of imagining the most wonderful possibilities because they seem too good to be true? I think Anglicans and Episcopalians, we might be especially prone to this because we value being the middle way, the via media. And I really love that about us. When we talk about what-if scenarios, especially at church, they are usually framed like this. What if it doesn't work? But I might reframe that and wonder, what if it does? What if we already have exactly who and what we need to make a real difference in our community, both as a church and as a neighborhood, and to show the love of Christ to the world right now? After all, Jesus warns us that if we are too cautious, that if we want to save our life, we may lose it. But if we are brave for the gospel, we may save it. The big capital C church around the world is often worried about shrinking numbers and irrelevance. But what if that's not the thing we need to be worried about? People worry about Christianity or mainline Protestantism declining. But I can't remember the commandment where Jesus says to go forth and make financially stable organizations that take very few risks and keep everyone very comfortable. I don't think he said that. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, or the sake of the gospel, will save it. What are we, St. Antony's, and individuals willing to risk for the gospel, for the good news of Christ's love? And perhaps even more importantly, what amazing possibilities are we laughing at because they seem too wonderful to be true? After all, is there anything too wonderful for God?